We continue, and we, Lord willing, will finish our study of Ruth, Ruth chapter 4, verses 11 through 22. It's been just a blessing of a book to my heart and my soul, and I trust it has been so for you, and in so many ways, as we'll see as we close the service with communion. This book, in a marvelous way, points forward to the coming of Christ and the redemption that we have in Christ. And all throughout the Old Testament, particularly in the law, God put in the law, the Mosaic covenant, glimpses of the gospel that we see even more clearly on this side of the cross. And particularly we see this in the book of Ruth. And it is to Christ that we look as a result of this book. As I was reflecting on the way that this book ends, we noted at the beginning of this book that this book really tells us of the gracious and unseen providence of God. God is sovereign. His providential control is over all that He has made, over every detail of our lives. And that providence is gracious. It is for our good, even when we don't deserve it. And that providence is so often unseen in our lives, particularly in those moments when we are faced with those instances, in those moments of great loss and grief. And one thing that I know personally about grief is that grief can be so blinding, that in the midst of our grief, we are blind to what God is doing, and in particular to the gracious character of our good God. But as we come to the end of this book, this gracious and unseen providence, particularly in Naomi's life, is not unseen anymore. It is seen. And like any good story, this story ends with all of the threads, all of the strands coming together in a marvelous way. And at the end, we see these threads coming together to put together this wonderful tapestry of God's gracious providence. And then we see, oh God, that is what you have been doing. This is what you've been up to. I knew that I could trust you, even in those moments when I was tempted to doubt your goodness. But still we trust, and then we see this is what you've been doing. I was thinking about the words of Job, those words that have become such a comfort and in many ways have become our words when we are confronted with loss. You remember when Job receives news just one after another, all his possessions have been lost to him, his 7 sons and his 3 daughters have been killed. And you remember those words of Job. He says, what? Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. What wonderful words those were that Job was allowed to speak. The Lord has given, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job worships. But you know, those words are not meant to be our final words. Those words were not meant to be Job's final words. Because if we end with those words, what do we end with? What note do we end on? The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. But you know, in the life of Job, his life doesn't end with God taking from him. His life ends with God pouring out upon him even more than he had before. And in particular, and most importantly of all, Job ends his ordeal with the greatest treasure of all, and that is a clearer picture of who God is. Worth more than all the treasures of this world. What we see in Job's life, what we see in Naomi's life, what you have seen in your life and what I've seen in mine, is this all-important principle. that when God takes away from his children, he does so that he might fill their lives with a fullness, with goodness, with evidences of his grace that they did not have prior to being emptied. A fullness that they could not have known had they not walked through that valley. This is why God takes away from us, so that he might give us even more in return. Do you know that in your life? Have you seen that in your life? When we remember this, the next time we are approached with loss, even loss of a great kind, we remind ourselves God gives and then takes away so that he might give us even more. And we see this principle operating not just in Naomi's life, but in the lives of all the major characters of this book, of Ruth and Boaz, and really, most importantly, in Naomi's life. But first, we see this in Ruth and Boaz's life. In verses 11 through 13 of chapter 4, we see blessings for Ruth and Boaz. And we noted, I can't remember if it was last week or the week before, that blessings have been pronounced on both Ruth and Boaz. Boaz in chapter 2, verse 20, Ruth in chapter 3, verse 10. And these blessings now begin to take shape. Boaz has just before all the elders and before the witnesses assembled at the gate has announced his intention to redeem all that belonged to Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion. And then he says that he has acquired Ruth as his wife in order to raise up a name for the deceased. And then he says at the end of verse 10, you are witnesses this day, meaning this is signed, sealed, and delivered this very moment. Nothing can undo what Boaz has announced that he will do. And then in verse 11, then all the people who were at the gate and the elder said, we are witnesses. And then they offer up this stunning prayer for Ruth. They say this, may the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. This is a stunning prayer as we've been tracking really the progression of Ruth. Ruth, the Moabitess, Ruth who comes into Israel, and you remember as she hears of the grace that Boaz extends to her, she says, how can I find such favor in your sight? Because I am a what? I am a foreigner. She recognizes that she is one who has been far off, far away from the people of Israel, coming in really as someone who didn't belong to the nation of Israel. And yet here in this verse, from the very lips of the elders of Bethlehem, they say, may this woman be like Rachel and Leah, arguably the two most important women in the history of Israel, the mothers of Israel, if you will, of the tribes of Israel. Gone is any sense that Ruth is this foreigner, this outcast, that she doesn't belong. They say, may the Lord make the woman. The verb behind this word make is the word to give. This word to give will appear 3 times in these 3 verses. And the sense is, may the Lord give to this woman that she be like Rachel and Leah. One woman becoming like 2. Now, we see here just how God had filled Ruth's life in place of what she lost, right? We see this. In chapter 1, verse 8, Naomi had urged Ruth and Orpah to return to their mother's home. And I think the idea behind the mother's home is where they would go to prepare for marriage, remarriage in Moab. Orpah returns to her mother's home. Ruth says, "No, Mom, I'm coming with you. I'm leaving behind my country, my people, my father, my mother, my home, any prospects for marriage in Moab. I'm leaving that all behind because your people will be my people," she says. "Your God will be my God." And here in verse 11, the people say, "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house." You see the word house there. She left behind her house, and in turn, she was given a new home. She left behind any hope of significance, of a future in Moab. And in place of the significance that she lost in Moab, here God is going to give her a significance that she could not even have fathomed in Israel. An importance to Israel that would rival even that of Rachel and Leah. And this will be through the offspring, the child, the children, I think, that she will bear. So we leave this prayer, this prayer from the lips of the elders and the people, wondering, well, what is it that Ruth's offspring will do for Israel? How will this prayer be answered? And the people and the elders move from Ruth now to pronouncing this benediction, this prayer upon Boaz. They say, "May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem." We're told in Genesis 35, verse 19, that Ephrathah is another word for Bethlehem, referring to the same place. They say, "May you act worthily in Ephrathah," worthily being the Hebrew word hayil. And we heard earlier in this book, Boaz was introduced to us in chapter 2, verse 1. He was a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, the same word there being used. An excellent man, a worthy man. And then in chapter 3, verse 11, Boaz tells Ruth that all my fellow townsmen, really the whole gate of my people, know that you are a worthy woman. She is an excellent woman, the same word again used. A woman who is hayil, excellent and worthy. And God is bringing this excellent man and this excellent woman together. You know, something you should do is, as you think about the book of Ruth, read Proverbs 31 and notice the many similarities between Proverbs 31 and the book of Ruth. Her worth, the excellent wife, her worth is far above rubies, above all the greatest jewels. And you see Boaz making that similar calculation, in a sense saying to the other man, "Okay, you can have all your money. I'll give up with what I have. This woman is worth more than all the money I have." Her works praise her in the gates, and so Ruth's works praise her in the gates. May you act worthily in Ephrathah. Her husband is known in the gates, right? Proverbs 31 tells us. And may you be renowned in Bethlehem. Literally, may your name be said, may your name be remembered in Bethlehem. Now, Boaz stands in stark contrast to the nameless Redeemer, the name whose name has passed away from all historical remembrance. We don't know his name. In fact, there's a fun rhyme that's used, Peloni Almoni, if you remember from last week. Really the nameless Redeemer, because he was unwilling to redeem Ruth. And here the elders and the people at the gate say, "May your name be said in Bethlehem. May your name be renowned. May you be remembered." And here we are. more than 3,000 years later, remembering the name of Boaz. And you see how this prayer, may your name be renowned in Bethlehem, God was answering their prayers even beyond what they could think, right? They were thinking of Bethlehem while God had in mind the world. And then the people look beyond Boaz to Boaz's future house, that is his descendants, his dynasty, in verse 12. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. And may your house be like that of Perez. Now, up until this point, what we know about Boaz's house, we actually don't know who was in Boaz's house. And I think very clearly if Boaz had been married or if he had children, the author would have told us. Boaz comes to us in this story as a single man, as a childless man, perhaps a widower or perhaps one who was never married at all. Maybe the point is that his home was empty. I don't think it's beyond a reasonable assumption to think that Boaz might have thought, what will become of my house? Will I have any heirs, any descendants, anyone to carry on my name? Up until this point, it seems like his house has been empty. And now we see what God has been planning. God has kept his house empty in a certain sense in preparation for Ruth to come from Moab. Boaz had to wait a long time for Ruth to come from Moab. And may your house be like the house of Perez, Perez being one of the two sons born to Judah by Tamar. Perez being the mightiest clan mightiest clan in Judah. Now this is a fascinating reference. Genesis 38 is the chapter where we read of Judah and Tamar, really the sinful circumstances that brought about Tamar's two sons by Judah. And the comparison here is not to say that every point in Tamar's story finds a correspondence to Ruth's story, but there are points of correspondence. Tamar being a Gentile, levirate marriage, or this concept of a kinsman redeemer factoring so hugely in both accounts. The importance of raising up a name for the deceased. God even using unusual and less than ideal, to put it mildly, circumstances to accomplish his will. These are the points of correspondence. But Perez, let's contemplate Perez for just a moment. Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. As you remember, Judah refused his final son in marriage to Tamar. Tamar entices her father-in-law, conceives by him, comes to discover that there are twins in her womb. And as she is giving birth, the hand of the first son emerges. And the midwife, very sagaciously, takes a scarlet thread and ties it quickly around his hand to indicate, remember, in this culture, who was the firstborn was so important. This was to indicate who was the first. But then, surprisingly, to the shock of those who were there, the hand of the first son, whose hand emerged first, withdrew. And it was as if in the womb, Perez says, bro, out of my way, I'm first. He made a breach. And this was why they named him Perez. Now, one of the questions you have to ask as you read through the Old Testament, really any of the narratives, is why are we given the details that we are given, and why are we not given the details that were not meant for us to know? The reason that we're told this very curious, this very interesting and unusual account of the birth of these two sons is this. God was not choosing the one who appeared to be first, Zerah, but his hand was on the son of his own choice, the one who should have been born second, but whom God was putting first. Now, God passing over the firstborn, or who should have been the firstborn, to put his hand on the one who wasn't the firstborn, that principle should sound very familiar to the readers of the book of Genesis, right? In fact, it goes back to the first sons that were born to Adam and Eve. It was not Cain who was chosen, through whom the Messiah would come, but it was Seth. It was not Ishmael who was Abraham's firstborn, but it was Isaac. It was not Esau who was the firstborn, but it was Jacob. And even amongst Jacob's sons, it was not his firstborn, Reuben, through whom the Messiah would come, but it would be Judah. We read of this in Genesis 49. That the scepter would not depart from the tribe of Judah. The Messiah, the promised offspring, the seed of the woman promised in Genesis 3:15 would not come through Reuben, but through Judah. And lo and behold, we're given this most unusual circumstance of how two sons were born to Judah. It is not Zerah through whom the Messiah would come, but Perez. And I think there are messianic aspirations or hopes here at the end of what they say in verse 12. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. Now, readers of the book of Genesis in particular will remember this word offspring, the same word used in Genesis 3:15, where God says to Satan, the offspring of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. And repeatedly, this word is used through the book of Genesis, this word offspring, as people are longing for and looking for this promised seed of the woman. So I believe that what they're even saying here is may your house, may your dynasty be like that of Perez, but then they're looking to the offspring, the child, the seed that will come to Boaz through Ruth. And it could be that they're saying, may the Messiah come through the offspring that will come to you by this young woman. And here we have the second use of this word to give, Natan, that the Lord will give you by this young woman. So again, this question begins to build. Well, what is God going to do through this child that he will give to Boaz and Ruth? These prayers are immediately answered in verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went in to her And the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Now, the picture, at least that I've had in my mind as I've been thinking about this, is Ruth's hands in Boaz's hands, and Boaz's hands in hers. Hands that were empty at one point. Boaz perhaps never being married, or perhaps a widower, and Ruth, one who had lost her husband, and now their hands and their hearts are full. And he went into her, speaking of the physical relations they had. Now, I believe this is one other clear indication that nothing immoral happened on the night when Ruth went to Boaz. It was only after Boaz took Ruth as his wife that he went into her. And the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Here is the third use of this word, natan, to give. That God is the one who is giving throughout. We see this. Now here in verse 13, if you read the book of Ruth very carefully, this is the only instance in the entire book where the author in the narrative, and not in recorded speech, in the narrative, tells us of a direct action of God. The only instance. All the other actions of God come to us through the words or the perceptions of people. Even in chapter 1, verse 6, where it says, "Now Naomi heard that Yahweh had visited his people to give them food." But even there, it's what she heard. Someone told her, Yahweh has visited us to give us food. But here in the narrative, this is the only place where the author says, well, let me tell you directly what it is that God has done. The Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. A son who can carry on the name of the deceased, a son. And it was the Lord who opened her womb. And by this, we are to understand that it was the Lord who had not allowed Ruth to conceive up until this point. Now remember, back to chapter 1, the way the narrative reads is, after Mahlon took Ruth as his wife, then they were in Moab for 10 years. And she had no children. There was a certain emptiness in their home, wasn't there? And now it all becomes clear. Why had God not given them children? Why had Yahweh not opened their womb up until this point? Well, it was so that she could have a child by Boaz. And that Boaz could function as the Redeemer and then raise up a name for the deceased. There was emptiness. But emptiness so that God might fill their lives with his fullness, and a fullness that could not have been experienced without the emptiness. Ruth bore a son. So we see Boaz's and Ruth's life filled to overflowing with the goodness of God. But really the narrative, the story has been moving towards Naomi. Naomi, who in so many ways is the main character of this book. And we see that God has a gift for Naomi in verses 14 through 17. There is a redeemer for Naomi. In verse 14, then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel." Now don't miss this reference to who says this, then the women. Where have we first met these women of the city? in chapter 1. When it says that, well, let me turn you back here. Chapter 1, verse 19. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" You sometimes wonder, as we read about this in Naomi's life, her suffering was very public, wasn't it? Her pain and her bitterness were very public. She didn't sneak into Bethlehem in the middle of the night. No, she came into Bethlehem, and the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women say, "Is this Naomi? I don't even recognize her. Is this the pleasant one?" And we wonder, God, why is it sometimes for certain people that you put their suffering and their pain on display before many people? It's not like they're trying to broadcast it. What's going on? And the final words from these women who said, "Is this Naomi?" In chapter 4, verse 14, notice what they end with. "Blessed be the Lord." This, by the way, being the first and only time in this entire book when people say, "Blessed be the Lord." Blessed be his name. People have said, "May Yahweh bless you." But now here it is the women who say, "Blessed be the Lord." And the point is this. God put Naomi's suffering before the town and before these women, and in certain instances, God puts the suffering of people before others, not to humiliate them, but to put on display his goodness before many, so that the lips of many would say, "Blessed be the Lord." Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a Redeemer. God has not left Naomi, right? And in a sense, Naomi was saying before the women, God's love and his goodness have left me. And here these women say, God has not left you. And he has not left you this day without a Redeemer. He's given you today a Redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. The same phrase being used here. May his name be said. May many people know his name, not just in Bethlehem now, but in Israel. And there's this building anticipation. God, you're doing something, not just in Ephrathah, not just in Bethlehem. You're doing something in Israel, where many people will hear about what has transpired, and they will know the name of this Redeemer. Who is this Redeemer? We might be tempted to think that it's Boaz, who has functioned as a Redeemer to Ruth and to Naomi. But we're told in verse 15 that this Redeemer is not Boaz, the one that these women are referring to. It's actually the son that has been born this very day. In verse 15, he shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Who is this Redeemer? His son. In what sense is he a Redeemer to Naomi? Verse 15, he shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. I think the idea here is this little boy is going to return your youth to you. And he's going to care for you in your old age. Now, one of the great blessings as a church family that we get to enjoy, one of the things that I love about His Place and what I hear from you, is we have those who are old and those who are young. We have grandparents and great-grandparents, and we have children that are being born to our church family. We rejoice. One of the delightful things to watch amongst you all is to see the joy come over your face, those who are older, when you see the little ones running around, hopefully not running around in the lobby, but there's a joy that comes over you, isn't there? And you offer up prayers for these children. And you say, God, would you grab a hold of the hearts of these little ones while they are still young? Would their hearts be yours? And would they be mighty men and women of God, excellent women and men? And would you use them? Would you bless them? Would your hand of protection be upon them? Would you keep them from the evil one? Would Christ be precious to them? Would you give grace to their parents to raise them in the fear and the admonition of the Lord so that Christ would be their treasure? These children restore the life and the youth to the old. These children will care for the old in their old age. These children, by the way, need you who are older to love them and to model Christ to them and to speak wisdom into their lives. This child will be a redeemer, this son, a restorer of life and a nourisher of Naomi's old age. And then they say why or how this child came to be. For your daughter-in-law who loves you. Your daughter-in-law who loves you. Not just daughter, but daughter-in-law. And I think here they're noting the unusual nature of what has happened in the relationship between Ruth and Naomi. It's unusual for a daughter-in-law to care for a mother-in-law in the way that Ruth has cared for Naomi. She loves her. And this love has found expression in sacrifice and servanthood. Your daughter-in-law who is more to you than 7 sons. Stunning. 7 being the number of completion. But these women say, this daughter-in-law is more to you than 7 sons. And in this word more, we have the final word, final use of the word tov in this book. She is tov, good to you. More good, if I can put it that way. More good to you than 7 sons. And of course, Ruth is a reflection of the very character of God, right? Ruth loves Naomi and is good to Naomi because God loves Naomi and is good to Naomi. And Ruth has given birth to him. And then here in verse 16, our final picture of Naomi is this in verse 16. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. Now, what's interesting about how these final verses break up, there's There's a prayer, a benediction offered at the gates, and then it says that Boaz took Ruth as his wife. And then there's another prayer and a benediction from the lips of the women in verses 14 and 15. And then in verse 16, then it says Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. The idea of nurse here is not that of a wet nurse, but of a guardian, his primary caretaker during the day. But just picture Naomi, if you can, in your mind. Her hands holding this son. Now, if you've ever seen a grandmother with her first grandchild, it is something to behold. I mean, there is a joy and a wonder. There is a peace and an awe that comes over them. Just picture Naomi now holding this grandson of hers. Proverbs 17, verse 22 tells us this: a joyful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. God has replaced Naomi's crushed spirit with a joyful heart that then becomes medicine to her entire body. Now, the significance of her full hands must not be lost on us. One author says this: in this last glimpse of Naomi, she is sitting with Boaz's and Naomi's son Obed in her arms. He is a handful for his once empty-handed grandmother. Naomi, who said, "I am empty," now literally has her hands quite full. I have a picture I'd like to share, if I can get that picture up on the screen here. This is my grandmother, my mother's mom. And her health was declining rapidly. She had a stroke. This picture was taken very shortly before she passed into glory, she being one who loved the Lord. Our firstborn was born just right before she passed. And we were able to visit her and take our son there. And you never forget certain moments, and this moment was one for me. You can see it in my grandmother's face, just the joy and the wonder that she was overcome with as she held her great-grandson in her lap and in her hands. And for just a moment, he became to her a restorer of her youth and a nourisher of her old age. And so it is with Naomi. She who had come back without her husband and her two sons from Moab to Israel. Now she holds in her hands a son, a child. And God has filled her life again. And the significance is not lost to the women of the city in verse 17. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." Did you get that? Not a son has been born to Ruth, which he was born to Ruth. Ruth was his mother. But it's as if they're watching Naomi holding this son. They recognize what God has done in Naomi's life. This son is every much hers as it is Ruth's. So they named him Obed. Now it could be, we don't know, that they're simply recognizing the name that Boaz and Ruth gave to him. Or it could be that for reasons unknown to us, not mentioned here, that for some reason they are allowed the privilege of naming this child. But the significance is in the name, Obed. Obed meaning one who serves, a servant. I think to commemorate the character of his parents, Ruth and Boaz, both servants of the living God and servants of those who were in need. Oh, our hearts are full of praise. I think about the words of this hymn, the words which find such glorious fulfillment in the book of Ruth. Praise to the Lord, who o'er all things so wondrously reigneth, shelters thee under his wings, yea, so gently sustaineth. Hast thou not seen how the desires have been granted in what he ordaineth? Now, I was listening to this song. I can't remember if it was last Sunday or just listening to it during the week. The last line in this verse just got me thinking. Have you not seen how your desires have been granted, given in what God has ordained for your life? We see this in Naomi's life. All her desires for fullness and for pleasantness, her desires for children and for posterity, for joy, she began to question whether she would ever have what she desired. And all her desires have been granted in what the good God ordained for her. For God so loved Naomi, right, that he gave her a redeemer. And just when we think that this book is done, just when we think that God has given all that he can give, the author has one more ace up his sleeves, one more surprise for us. We see in verses 17 through 22 that God is preparing to give a king for Israel and for the world. We cannot see what God is doing in our trials. We can't see what he's doing even in our blessings, what God is meaning to do in our lives. We slowly begin to see. But in the midst of our trials, in the midst of our blessings, God is planning to do something not only in our lives, but in the lives of people who have yet to be born. Do you believe this? That God is planning to pour out his grace upon a people yet to be born, through the valleys that he calls you to walk through, and through the triumphs that he gives you as you walk through those valleys. And this is what we see in this genealogy. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. I think it's brilliant what the author does. He quickly tells you the end. This is going to David. And then he goes back in verse 18 and says, let me tell you how we got there. Let me remind you. Now these are the generations of Perez. Do you remember how Perez was born? Right? Through messy circumstances. But even in the midst of the mess, God was there, preparing the lineage of the one who would be king. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. What a mic drop. What a way to end the book. David, this is where it's been going. So the book ends with the answer to the dilemma presented with how it began, doesn't it? Back in chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled. If you turn back one page to the last verse of the book of Judges, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. We need a king after God's own heart to take us out of this dark period where everyone does what is right in their own eyes. Can you relate to that today? Where there is no king in this world, a king after God's own heart, and everyone on planet Earth, it seems like, is doing what is right in their own eyes. We need a king, the only king. You see, in the dark days of the judges, God was slowly, quietly, sovereignly preparing the way for the king, King David, the one who would lead them out of this dark period. And God was stamping in David's own DNA what he wanted this king to be and to do. He wanted this king to be a king not just for Israel, not just for Jews like Boaz and Naomi, but for Gentiles like Ruth. Ruth, who came from a far away land. And this is the kind of king that Jesus is. In Jesus' own DNA, you find people such as Tamar, such as Rahab, such as Ruth. He is the Redeemer for the world. Now, just preparing our hearts for communion here, think about the points of correspondence in this book to us. There was a woman who came from a faraway land, a woman who needed a husband, a woman who needed to be redeemed by this husband. This husband took her in, redeemed her, brought her into his own family so that she might belong to him, and all that was his would belong to her. This is Christ, isn't it? And this is us. Let's pray. Our Father, we give you thanks that in the fullness of time you sent your Son of the nation of Israel, he who would be our kinsman redeemer, redeemer for the nations. What joy there is to find refuge and rest in him who paid the price of our redemption. Pray all this in his most precious name. Amen.